So imagine that you're involved in a project where, through a participatory process, you've somehow agreed that it's important to try and quantify, value, and perhaps even monetize some services that fall within the cultural services category. Things like the beauty of a landscape or the quietness of an area. How do you quantify such services that don't have a market that is affiliated with it? One way in which you can do that is through the hedonic pricing approach. Basically what we're going to use is an existing auxiliary market to try and indirectly get at the value of something. So one case that's often used is that of the housing price market. Here we're going to use rents or the sale prices of houses to try and infer indirectly how much people are willing to pay in terms of a surplus to get at a beautiful feature of the landscape, for example. In theory, the ideal situation would be where you have two housing units that are identical in their shape and their age, but one is close to the feature of interest, like the landscape or the silent environment, and one is far from the feature of interest. And by comparing the difference in price, and ideally by comparing many pairs of housing units like that, you could get at the difference or the added value that comes from the feature of interest. That's not possible in practice because houses are not arranged that way in the landscape. Instead, what we're going to do is use a statistical approach. And indeed, large insurance companies and large owners of multiple housing units know fairly well the different factors that affect the price of a housing unit. We know that the size of the house, the number of rooms, how old or new the house is, where it's situated within the neighborhood, the amenities that it has, like a balcony or a chimney or a garage. These are all individual factors that will influence the price. But what you can then do is you can add in the additional variable of the landscape, of the viewshed, of the noise to try and predict what the future price might be. So the specific study that I'm going to talk about as a case study was conducted by a Swiss bank that has many residential holdings. And they were interested initially in trying to understand the influence of urban noise and traffic from cars and from railroads on the value of their properties. So what they did is they took a large collection of thousands of residences and they built their statistical model to explain the variation in price within them. And then they constructed a few additional variables that are going to be of particular interest to us. First of all, they took a layer of information called a GIS layer that was produced by the Swiss Federal Office of the Environment on noise throughout the entire country. And they integrated this and associated the level of noise that is closest to each resident and attributed that value. Second of all, they created a landscape beauty layer, and they did this in two steps. First of all, they looked at where within the country of Switzerland one had a beautiful view of the lake and whether that could be seen from the apartment. They also added the additional information of how many mountain peaks they could see from that location, because that will influence, of course, how beautiful the lake is as well. By integrating these variables, they were able to find out what percentage people were willing to pay as a surplus to their normal rent to access these types of attributes. So the question is, how much would you pay for a beautiful view and a quiet environment? Would you pay 1% more of your rent, 10%, or 50%? It turns out that, at least in Switzerland, renters are willing to pay a surplus of about 10% to have of their rent in order to have access to a view with at least 10 mountain peaks in the background. In addition, they're willing to pay an additional percentage to be in a quiet environment. Now, the noise was a little bit more complicated because it depended on whether it was railroad noise or road noise, but roughly speaking, people were willing to pay about 5 to 8% premium in order to save about 20 decibels worth of noise. So this is just one study of many that have looked or used the hedonic pricing method to try and get at the value of different landscape features for people. And I encourage you to read some of the links below where they've looked at the importance of the presence of a farmland or the presence of a park and the surplus that people are willing to pay to be near those amenities or to avoid, of course, noise, just like in this study. two limitations of these studies are, first of all, it turns out for anyone who's used multiple regression methods and lots of data, that when you're looking at these secondary or tertiary factors, they can be easily influenced by an outlier. And so it's worthwhile taking with a grain of salt the actual values and monetary values that have come out of them, because there's going to be a lot of variation. And in one of the studies that I referenced below, you'll see that when people tried to look at the value of being close to a park, and they did a meta-analysis where they looked at numerous studies, it turns out there's actually a lot of variation in the price and how it changes with each meter that you get further from the park. But nevertheless, this hedonic valuation method can be very interesting for bringing to light these services that otherwise are fairly intangible and difficult to describe, especially when it's in a context when you're presented with alternative scenarios and you have to make the case that these types of things can be fairly important.